The core of this series is to investigate and then define a plan of action for living our faith in life. We want to answer several questions, the most important of which is, what is the greatest good? I think this is a foundational question for understanding how to engage in life as a person of faith in the Creator of God. If we understand well the answer to this question, it can act as a quick start guide to help guide us through the moments when our faith is under stress. All of us have probably experienced this type of scenario. We wake up in the morning and we start our day and we turn on our computer and nothing happens. Or we try to start the car and nothing happens. Or worse, the coffee maker won't make coffee. Something is wrong. At that moment, we don't need an explanation about the inherent design flaws with hard disk drives, or the theory of magnetic flux in the design of a car alternator, or the size of the temperature thermostat control in a coffee maker. What we really need is for the thing just to work. We don't need theory or trivia. We need a solution. Unfortunately, we often approach our faith life that same way. We just want it to work. And if it doesn't work, by which we may mean any number of things, our tendency is to throw it out and to get a new one. But unlike a computer or a car or a coffee maker, faith systems are not products that provide a resource or solve a problem. They can't be used and discarded at will. Any faith that is simply a system is bound to fail. That's why it's important for us to have an understanding of the nature of our faith. And since our faith is relational in nature, it means understanding our relationship with God and the world He has created. In pursuit of answering the question, what is the greatest good, we must begin with an understanding of basic knowledge of the nature of God's created order. What is this reality in which we find ourselves? Our beliefs about all of this and where it came from will determine our understanding of the purpose and nature of life itself, and provides context and a platform for understanding the problem of evil, understanding what leads us into despair, and the source of hope. This just isn't a study of theory or the science of origins, but it's understanding the context in which God has placed us, how God has created things, so we can answer the question, what is the greatest good? So understanding the nature of God's creation is absolutely critical to living our faith in the context of our social and cultural reality. We cannot isolate our faith, as we said in the last video, from the rest of life. It needs to saturate this reality. But this reality exists in a creation created by God. So what are the foundational things we need to understand about this creation so we can then understand our faith in that context? Well, it's a complex question, as you can imagine, but there are 5 observations that we can make about the nature of God's creation in preparation for living our faith in life. The first observation is that God's creation is good. In the creation narratives, that is repeated over and over again, that God created and He saw it was good. And at the very end, He says, it is very good. Now, this is not speaking to the quality of God's workmanship. This is speaking to the fact that it was created to accomplish the purposes God had determined before eternity, and that it has inherent value. That's why when we sinned and rebelled against God, He didn't just destroy it and start over. Creation has inherent value, value so great that He sent His Son to die on the cross so we could be reconciled back to God. Secondly, creation, because it is good and it has value, it is open to God's providential hand. There is a tension here we don't fully understand, how we can have on one hand our free will, and God has granted us the autonomy or the independence to make decisions, and yet on the other hand, He has complete sovereign authority over all things. But it is not a closed system. All that exists, everything everywhere that exists, is subject to God's authority. It does not work independently of God. It is an open system, not a closed system. And God providentially engages in his creation regularly. Third, we see that it continues to be saturated by sin. Unfortunately, our choices as sinful beings, going all the way back to Adam and Eve, have polluted God's creation, and it is saturated by sin. That doesn't deter from its value, but it does mean it does not function as originally designed. And God commented on that whenever he sent Adam and Eve from the garden. He said, now you're going to have to labor intensely to raise things from the soil. There was always work, but now it's a different kind of work. Weeds and thorns will be part of that process. Child rearing will be painful. Childbirth will be painful. It's saturated by sin. But it's also saturated or has been invaded by God's grace. In the very beginning, Adam and Eve, although they sinned against God, God immediately responded to them in grace. And although he had to protect them from that tree of life, whatever that was an act of his grace. And when they were naked and ashamed of their nakedness, he provided clothing for them. That was an act of his grace. And he continues to sustain the world so they could eat and be cared for and have shelter. It's an act of his grace. And that grace is still active today. God's common grace, the rain that falls on the just and the unjust, is still very much alive today, and that grace continues to invade all of creation. And ultimately, that grace is demonstrated to us by the love of God for all that he has created, but especially for us as his image bearers, in that he sent his son to die on the cross, raised him from the dead as a demonstration of his authority, and now has seated him at the right hand of God the Father. And then finally, the purposes of God are still being accomplished. Allow me to read from Psalm 145 that speaks of God's creation and his purposes. Psalm 145. It says, I will extol you, my God the King. I will praise your name forever and ever. Every day I will praise you and extol your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom. One generation will commend your works to another. They will tell of your mighty acts. They will speak of your glorious splendor of your majesty. And I will meditate on your wonderful works. They will tell of the power of your awesome works, and I will proclaim your great deeds. They will celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all, his compassion on all he has made. And all you have made will praise you, O Lord. Your saints will extol you. They will tell of the glory of your kingdom and speak of your might, so that all men may know of your mighty acts and the glorious splendor of your kingdom. For your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures through all generations. The Lord is faithful to all his promises and loving toward all he has made. The Lord upholds all those who fall and lifts up all those who are bowed down. The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food at their proper time. You open your hand, and you satisfy the desires of every living thing. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and loving toward all he has made. The Lord is near to all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desires of those who fear him. He hears their cry and saves them. The Lord watches over all who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. My mouth will speak in the praise of the Lord. Let every creature praise his holy name forever and ever. And the psalmist is reflecting on that connection between God being creator and God's grace still invading his creation, even though it is saturated and permeated by sin. So then, how do we understand God's creation, and what is the greatest good that comes out of this? Well, first, we need to recognize that we, as the pinnacle of God's creation, as God created humanity, we have been given a dual role in God's creation. First is to represent the creator in his creation, to be a caretaker of God's creation, and secondly, to steward the resources of the king in his kingdom. God is both creator and king, and we serve as his representatives, as his caretakers in his creation. And that is the beginning of how our life, of how our faith engages in life. Understanding our role in God's creation, the nature of his creation, and we are here as caretakers to represent him and to steward his resources. And the greatest demonstration of that, the greatest way we can do that, is by being loving and truthful and caring with the other greatest resource in God's creation, other people. So as our faith engages in life, it is a relational faith that speaks lovingly and truthfully to those around us. And we will get into more detail about how we do that and what that looks like in the next couple of weeks. But for now, we need to sharpen our focus specifically on the nature of God's creation so we can fulfill our role as his representatives. And we sharpen that with these three thoughts. First, God is not a victim of sin. God is not a victim of what's happening in our society and our culture, because the rebellion against him, the sinfulness, has been there from the beginning of Adam and Eve and onward, and from the beginning of eternity. In eternity past, God had put into place the plan of redemption so we could be reconciled back to him. So God is not a victim, and we see the social pressures and the changes taking place in our culture. God is not victimized. Secondly, God is not at war to try and reclaim his creation. He has never abdicated his throne. This is not a battle of good versus evil. We may have greater challenges in representing him well, and there may be a greater level of denial of the truth of who God is. The rebellion may be louder than God's grace, but it's not a war, because it's only rebellion against God, and God has already won. And then finally, we need to recognize that God's common grace still permeates everything. There is still that rain that falls on all of us, the breath in our lungs, and the ability for us in all of creation to see the handiwork of God. And there's an innate understanding that, yes, there is a God. So what is the greatest good that we can do? That's how we started this video. That is, I think, the first question that needs to be answered. If we are going to represent God well, if we are going to be effective in living our faith in life. And the greatest good is this, that we represent Christ well. The greatest good we can do in life is to live our lives in such a way that we represent Christ, we represent his kingdom well. And the next couple of videos, we're going to explore what that means and what that looks like. But let me just give this quick summary. It means we live lives that are credible in the context of the gospel. It means we live lives that are compassionate as we engage with other people. And it means we live lives that demonstrate our citizenship is in the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. And if we do those things well and skillfully as we engage in life, there are going to be some challenges. It is not going to be easy, but it represents the God who created us, and it gives us context and confidence and courage to move forward because we are engaging in life in a way that is consistent with our faith. So for the next 3 or 4 weeks, that is what we're going to look at. How do we express our faith in such a way that it represents Christ well, it completes that purpose for which we were created, and it demonstrates to our culture and to our society the truth of a loving, gracious, merciful, yet also holy, just, and righteous God. An amazing responsibility God has delegated to us, and yet totally possible because the Spirit of God transforms us and because God is still engaged in his creation. It's an open system. He still is providentially caring for it. So let me invite you to join us for the next couple of weeks as we look more specifically in how to live our life, our faith, in this context of social and cultural pressures that demonstrate credibility of the gospel, compassion for those that God has created, and a citizenship that is in heaven.